Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 16th of January of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. If you remember a few weeks ago, we were talking about that the Institute of Study of War reported that the Russians were planning to start their offensive operation, another wave of greatest offensive operation somewhere at 15th of January. And we were expecting this date, and when talking about the common situation, it's very difficult to understand whether the Russians started or not. But when talking about the numbers that were provided by the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russians launched the next wave of offensive operation all over the combat line, starting from Sinkovka to Krynki. According to the Ministry of Defense, the total losses of the Ukrainians just during the previous since the 15th till 16th of January were around 990 soldiers, significant number, and this is the record of 2024. I don't remember when exactly the Ukrainians had the same level of losses. Probably during the previous year, maybe somewhere during the battle for Abotsina or something like this. But anyway, the Russians launched an offensive operation. They're attacking everywhere, and for now the Russians probably managed to achieve some results to capture more territories, but neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians have provided us any updates about these attacks. Now let's start from the Sinkovka and we will finish with Krynki. According to information we have, the Russians launched their offensive operation. The Ukrainian sources reported that situation in the vicinity of the village is critical and very difficult, but yet we haven't received any geolocated confirmation of any Russian attack either in the forest or somewhere in the vicinity of this territory. During the previous days the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces, and the most important thing probably is that the Russians start using helicopters Ka-52 on Kupiansk direction. If you remember, the last time we saw and heard any news about this type of vehicles, these aircrafts, helicopters, during the battle for Abotsina or during the battle in the South Donetsk direction on Vremivka tactical bridgehead. After September or probably late August, the Ka-52 have almost disappeared from the combat lines, and now we see their return. And as we can see, the first area the Russians have redeployed this type of weapon is Sinkovka. Probably the Russians understand the value of this area, and they try to reinforce this territory with Ka-52 that can destroy the tanks and the most important probably let's say Abrams on this direction, because I think that the first Abrams will appear here within a distance. Now we are moving to Liman area, and according to the Ministry of Defense, the losses is also very heavy from the Ukrainian side. 250 soldiers the Ukrainians lost just during the previous 24 hours, significant number. The Russians managed to repel 4 attacks of 63rd Mechanized and 25th Air Assault Brigades of Ukrainian forces in the vicinity in the areas of the settlement Chervona Dibrova and Yampolovka and so on. So 25th Brigade, this is the 25th Brigade in this area, airborne. Mainly, as you can see, this brigade is located on the line between Nevskaya, Novosadova, Terny, so in the area where the Russians managed to advance recently, and the attacks of 63rd Mechanized Brigade, which is located according to the deployment map somewhere in reserves, but probably they will redeploy to reinforce the 25th Brigade. Now we are moving to Solidar area, first to Kremenaya Forest. Yes, we got one geolocated video. The Ukrainian sources published the video how they were bombing and attacking the Russian forces with FPV drones in the forest, and according to geolocations, one of the strikes was geolocated somewhere in this part of the forest. So according to Ukrainian sources, probably this territory is under complete Russian control. We will adjust this forest due to the geolocation that was provided by the Ukrainians. The Russians launched another attack from Shipilovka and from Lysychansk in direction of Belogorovka. The Russians during the previous 24 hours were using 2 roads for attack. This is the first one, but that attack was repelled, and mainly by attacks of FPV drones. The Russians just haven't managed to get even the combat pivot line because they was under very heavy fire. But maybe the main purpose was just to force the Ukrainians to change their focus and to concentrate their FPV drone operators in this area. Meanwhile, the second Russian road, the second Russian fist attacked something like this, and as a result of very heavy clashes, they managed to establish control over this industrial area. For now, we're not going to change the map, and maybe I know that the Russians during the previous year managed to establish control, captured this industrial area probably 3 or 4 or 5 times in a row. Maybe they had some plans, but after that, always the Ukrainians managed to counterattack and to restore control, because the main positions on this area are of Ukrainian forces are located behind Bilogorovka on these hills, and this territory is under complete protection of 81st Air Mobile Brigade of Ukrainian forces. So all these advances, all this progress from the Russian side is just the first step in the few layers operation to capture entire Bilogorovka. But without the hills, there is nothing to talk about. Now we are moving to the south in direction of Vyimka. The Russians also launched another wave of offensive operation along the railways from Bilogorovka to Vyimka, and in front of the, let's say, edge advanced Russian troopers, the Russians FPV drone operators are bombing the Ukrainian forces, trying to clear the trenches, fortifications, and just to ease the progress of the Russian infantry. We have a lot of geolocations which confirms this certain Russian advance to the north, where the Russians are trying to encircle Veselaya and to create a very difficult situation for Ukrainian defense belt from Razdolovka, Veselaya, and of course the village by the name of Sporne. So the situation is very critical either. Now we are moving to Bogdanovka direction, and we have significant number of very interesting geolocations from the line between Bogdanovka, New Cemetery, railways, and Popov Forest. The Russians, to be more precise, the forces of 98 Air Assault Division launched a very powerful full-scale offensive operation in many directions. First, during the previous 24 hours, during the first phase of that offensive operation, the Russians were bombing and attacking these territories with FPV drones, trying to destroy the Ukrainians inside of the trenches, strongholds, and so on. During those attacks, they managed to destroy a significant number of Ukrainian positions. And after all these FPV drone strikes, the Russians launched, this is the stronghold that was destroyed, machine gun position, a lot of FPV drone bombings, lots of infantry were bombed. So there was a very hard job made by the Russians before the beginning of the ground operation. For example, on this video we can see also the FPV drone strikes and the moment when the Russians destroyed the Ukrainian machine gun position. This is it. FPV drone bombing, probably there was something like ammo, and after secondary detonation this machine gun position was destroyed. This is one of the most important and powerful strongholds in the Ukrainian defense belt, and as you can see, according at least to all these videos, the Russians managed to crack this net, and they managed probably to enter, to clear, yet we haven't received any geolocated confirmation of Russian presence there, but obviously we're gonna receive some. So after these FPV drone strikes, some of them also took place during the previous night in Bogdanovka itself. It was like the beginning of operation, and after all these FPV drone strikes all over this territory, the Russians launched the ground operation. For those purposes, the Russians were attacking this territory from many directions, and for example on this video we can see how the Russian infantry landed on the fields, and after that they started clearing the trenches. This is very important video. I would like to point your attention to this personnel carrier. As you can see, there is additional defense on top of the personnel carrier, and the main purpose of this defense belt is to reduce the damage that Ukrainian FPV drones can make. Once again, this is like unusual construction on top of the personnel carrier, and obviously this is a very good idea to save the lives and secure the Russian stormtroopers during their offensive operation. On this sense, we can see the ground operation somewhere along these tree lines. As a result of clashes, the Russians entered the Ukrainian defense belt and started the clearing operation. A little bit From the same area but from another angle and from another sector, we have another video geolocated confirmation of Russian presence somewhere along the trenches. The Russian infantry was clearing work, trying to clear the territory. There was a close combat with Ukrainian forces, and they were moving slowly, step by step, from one position to another. So anyway, as we can see, that was a very rich day for events for 98th Air Assault Russian Division. Probably they managed to achieve significant results on this territory. We need to wait for a little bit more, because yet we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation of, let's say, Russian control. We have a lot of Russian attacks, FPV drone strikes, but without any video of Russian control. But some sources have already reported about additional progress of the Russians inside of Bogdanovka, so we'll see what is going to be next. At the same time, the Russian forces launched another wave of attack in the vicinity of 215.7 hill. The Russians were attacking the next defense belt in front of Ivanovska. Very difficult to understand and to tell how exactly this operation ended. And the Russians were using different significant number of armored vehicles, tanks, personnel carriers. As you can see, the Ukrainians during the Russian attack were trying to slow the Russians down. They were attacking them with FPV drones, and we see the Russian tank attacking the Ukrainian stronghold. Once again, this video was published by the Ukrainian forces. It's a part of propaganda, so we will not see whether the Russians managed to achieve any results or not. But anyway, this is another evidence of full-scale Russian offensive operation all over the combat line, starting from Avdiivka till Krynki and so on, starting from Kupiansk till Krynki. And now we are moving further to Avdiivka direction, where the Russians launched another full-scale offensive operation all over the entire combat line, starting from the northern direction to the southern. During the previous few days, the Russians were bombing Avdiivka very heavy, with different types of weapon. On this video, we can see the footage of Avdiivka somewhere from Donetsk, and on this video, we can see significant number of Su-25 that were flying above this territory and that were bombing the Ukrainian positions inside of the village. After these aviation bombings of the village of Avdiivka, after the Russians bombed the city with FABs from the north to the southern part, after the Russians attacked and destroyed the Ukrainian artillery forces with accurate artillery rounds Krasnopol, and this is the use, for example, of Krasnopol rounds, the Russians launched full-scale offensive operation. As for 16th of January of evening of this day, we got just one geolocated video attack, and that attack took place in the eastern part of Avdiivka. On this video that was published by the 110th Mechanized Brigade, we can see another Russian heavy armored convoy that was moving somewhere from Veselaya Krasnogorovka to the south, along Kamyanka village in direction of the eastern Avdiivka. Lots of tanks, at least 2 tanks and 4 personnel carriers with stormtroopers, were bypassing the fields. The most important thing that you need to know that there is almost no resistance from the Ukrainian side, no artillery strikes, no minefields, nothing that Ukrainians made to slow down or to stop the Russians. As we can see, the Russians managed to bypass the distance very easy. They managed to land the infantry and to start storming operation. According to the geolocations and according to this video, we know for sure where exactly the Russians were moving, and according to information we have, the Russians were moving along from Veselaya. This is the village from Veselaya, so they were moving something like along this road. They entered this part of the village, then they started moving to the south. They landed a significant number of infantry along this tree line, and from this territory the Russians continue offensive operation along the tree lines that located to the east of Avdiivka. Very likely the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukraine's defense belt and to advance along these tree lines, and which of course is a very big problem for the Ukrainians, and the most important for the Ukrainian stronghold that located on the edge eastern part of Avdiivka. The Russians are trying to bypass this stronghold from the west and to attack this area from behind. So a very interesting plan. We'll see whether the Russians are able to complete this mission or not. Furthermore, the second wave of attack the Russians made somewhere along the, let's say, chemical plant. The Russians were moving their infantry inside of these daches and inside of this residential area, but that attack was very difficult because the Ukrainians from a chemical plant all the way the Russians were moving, they were attacking the Russians with FPV drones, which caused significant damage. But regarding these attacks, the Russians managed to dig in deeper in this residential area and to improve their positions on the east from Avdiivka chemical plant. And the most probably important update, as for me, the Russians, after they managed to concentrate the critical mass on the northern edge of Avdiivka area, we are talking about this territory, launched the full-scale offensive operation to improve their positions along the main stronghold belts in this area. The Russians started their movements to the west, and the Russians started their movements to the north in direction of Keramik and Novokalinovo. We have geolocated videos. The Russian FPV drone strikes before the Russians start the ground operation were clearing this territory. We have significant number of strikes with this type of weapon, lots of armored vehicles, lots of Ukrainian positions. Ukrainian soldiers were damaged by these drones, and after the Russians cleared this territory, they launched the ground operation. Yet we haven't received any geolocated confirmation of territory control because it's too early. The Russians just launched the full-scale operation. Probably they managed to improve their positions. Now they're trying to dig in deeper this night, and the Ukrainians probably will counterattack during this night and the next day, trying to return the lost positions. And if the Russians are able to repel, then they will continue moving further. So the battle has started. The winter hell has started. We'll see what kind of results the end of late January and the early February will bring to the Russians. But as we know, according to the Western sources, they think that this attack may bring the Russians significant results and that the entire Ukrainian defense belt will collapse. So we'll see. We have some updates from Mariinka area. The Russians also continued their offensive operation in direction of Georgievka. They didn't stop ever, so they continue attacks, and for these purposes they continue clearing operation with FPV drones. And if we increase the numbers of updates from this area, and this is the most important probably thing, that the Russian focus is moving block by block, street by street to the west. So first, the FPV drones were in the vicinity of the church. Then the Russians moved to the west, then further to the west, and then further to the west. So as I understand that the Russian infantry and FPV drones are moving along these FPV drone strike roads. So probably and very likely that during the previous days the Russians managed to improve their positions further to the west, and now the area of Russian control is something like this. So they can't be very far from the FPV drone strikes. They need to keep signal, they need to save signal, so that's why they need to keep a distance maybe 500 from 300 meters to till 1 kilometer. So they need to be very close to keep this signal and to bring the best result of FPV drone strikes. Furthermore, we got a very interesting video from the chemical plants that located to the south of Krasnogorovka, but this video was published by the Ukrainian sources. On this video we can see how the Ukrainian forces were bombing and attacking the Russian infantry with FPV drones in the chemical plant. So this thing is and schema is very simple. While the Russians are pushing in direction of Georgievka, and the Ukrainians understand that very likely the Russians are able to achieve some results, the Ukrainians are making some plan or trying to create a plan how to counterattack the Russians from the north in direction of the coal mine, and to just basically to stop the Russians and to force the Russians to send some reserves from, let's say, Mariinka, Georgievka to the north for stabilization of the front line. So this is the only option, at least for now, the Ukrainians found how to slow down and to stop the Russian activity and the Russian significant progress. So we'll see whether they're able to do this or not, because after FPV drone strikes, we know that there is a ground operation comes always. Now we are moving to Novomikhailivka. Today we got more details on geolocations from the South Donetsk direction, where the Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours also had a significant level of losses. Most of the mappers have already, and reliable sources, Russian sources, have already reported and updated that as a result of Russian offensive operation, they managed to improve their positions and to capture the next tree line. If you remember, just yesterday we were talking how the Russians managed to repel the Ukrainian counterattack of 72nd Mechanized Brigade on this intersection of tree lines, and after that attack was repelled successfully, the Russians continue advancing further to the west. And now, according to some sources, this is the current progress and current territory that is under complete Russian control on the South Donetsk direction. So we see that the Russians are getting closer and closer to the main road that connects Ugledar with Konstantinovka. And furthermore, the Russians, if this progress is correct and if this information is correct, managed to block the Ukrainian forces from Novomikhailivka, from the southwest, and from now on, the Ukrainians are no longer able to counterattack the Russians and to attack their flanks using these roads, because they will face always the Russian defense belt and they always will be defeated. What is the next Russian plans? We see that the Russians are advancing very fast, and this is important note that you need to pay attention to. The Russians are advancing almost like one line field for 3-4 days. So that means that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 field lines when the Russians get the road T0524. So probably within the next 20 days, even maybe earlier, the Russians will be able to establish control over something like this if the Ukrainians are not be able to find any solution how to slow down or to stop the Russian progress in this area. And if the Russians do have possibilities to capture this significant territory within the next 20 days, then they will get as close as possible to the main Ukrainian road, this one, and to establish complete fire control over this territory. And this will cause significant damage to Ukrainian logistics, because now, as you know, the supply road that Ukrainians use from Konstantinovka to Ugledar is around, let's say, 15 kilometers. But if the Russians are able to get to this road till the level of fire control, then the Ukrainians supply road will be increased till, let's say, 30 kilometers. So twice it will be increased twicely, which will maybe from small numbers, it's not going to affect a lot, but anyway, this will reduce the Ukrainian possibilities, and the most important, this will reduce the Ukrainian timings for reaction. So now the Ukrainians need to bypass just 15 kilometers if they need to redeploy operational reserves from one side to another. Now, and after this configuration, they will be forced to spend 2 times more time, and this can lead to unpredictable consequences. Furthermore, obviously the Russians are not going to stop on this line if they see that they can continue their offensive operation. Of course, they will continue movements until they get and physically cuts the main road between Ugledar and Konstantinovka. Anyway, at least as for me, Novomikhailivka currently is the most successful front line for the Russian forces. They're not just advancing, they're making some maneuvers, they're trying to make some tactics, they're doing everything very smart. It's like they're playing in checkmates in this area. When talking about every single other front line, also except Krynki, there are also something very interesting, and someone very smart is operating in Krynki from the Russian side, and in Novomikhailivka. I understand they're the most experienced and the smartest commanders of the Russian army. Now we are moving further to Zaporozhye area. We haven't received lots of updates, just few details of battle to the northwest of Verbova. FPV drone strikes without any activity on the ground. Now we are moving to Krynki. We have a lot of very interesting details. The Russians continue bombing the Ukrainian bank of the river with different types of weapons. On this video we can see either Iskander strike or FAP 500, and as a result of the strike we see very heavy explosion, probably secondary detonation. That was ammo depot in Beryslev along the Dnipro River. So the situation, of course, is getting worse and worse. When talking about the Krinky foothold, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces with Lancet, with different types of weapon. The Ukrainians continue losing artillery forces, tank, armored vehicles, personal carriers, infantry, boats. So the losses currently are very heavy. Just 65 soldiers during the previous 24 hours. The Dnipro River, the Ukrainians still have possibilities to use Dnipro River, but when talking about the rivers among the islands, these rivers are freezed, and the Ukrainians also lost possibilities to supply their forces. They need to do like a very big lot of activities to get there. So this is another very negative factor for the Ukrainian forces on this foothold. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, share my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.